G'day, I'm Ben Lawson from Common Thread Consulting. A safe and secure water supply is one of our most fundamental needs, right? So gaining assurance that our local governments can and will meet that need is vital. And while we're there with water quality, we don't think twice about drinking water out of the tap. We have a high level of trust. We know it's safe. We're not there with water security. But it's a different sort of problem, right? Water quality is an ongoing issue, but water security only emerges as a problem in a drought. It last became a problem in 2019, and the fallout prompted this performance audit from the Auditor General the following year. The title points to what the Auditor General seems to have diagnosed as the problem: a lack of support from a department within New South Wales Government for regional town water supplies. So how bad was it? She says around 10 cities and towns in regional New South Wales were close to zero water, and others had 6 to 12 months supply. But I read a post from Brendan Guiney, the Executive Officer of the Water Directorate, the other day, saying that at least 50 water supply schemes across regional New South Wales were at high risk of failure. The Auditor General concluded the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, now the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, henceforth the department, had not effectively supported or overseen town water infrastructure planning since at least 2014, and also lacked a strategic evidence-based approach to target investments in town water infrastructure. These are two distinct but related issues. Plans establish an evidence base to target investments, but the problem in a drought is a lack of water, not a lack of plans or a lack of investment. The fact that there were less than 10% of local water utilities with strategic plans in place at the time of the drought, and 5 years on, there's still less than 10%, is clear evidence that there's a problem. And I'm going to argue that this is first and foremost about roles. The presumption that sits behind our state government's approach, as seen here in this audit, is that local government is incapable of solving its problems. Council needs state government departments to solve their problems. They don't. They need state government to target investment in their town water infrastructure that is beyond the capacity of the local community to come up with themselves, at least not without major sacrifices. And my hope is that once local leaders recognise that this is the only thing they really need from state government, they might recognise that what state government needs from them is forewarning backed by sufficient evidence that they've got a problem with their water supply, and that will enable the department to target the investment that you need to help deliver a solution to your problems. So local government needs to wake up and smell the coffee. Our state government is incapable of solving your problems for you. This is not my opinion. This is what our Auditor General has concluded. And it's far worse than it appears, because our state government is confused about its own roles in solving this problem, let alone how to solve it. The Auditor General says here that the department is the primary regulator of local water utilities. It's not. It aspires to be. That's no doubt where this misconception came from. But it has no regulatory authority whatsoever to compel the 90% of councils who it categorises as not participating in its assurance framework for local water utilities to do so. The primary regulator of local government in New South Wales, including in relation to their local water utility functions, is the Office of Local Government. But given that the Auditor General concluded here in this audit of OLG a couple of years after her audit of the department, that OLG does not conduct effective, proactive monitoring to enable timely risk-based responses to council performance and compliance issues. For example, monitoring the performance in relation to the security of the water supply. She also found OLG has made limited progress resurrecting its Promoting Better Practice Review program, which since 2014, and that included best practice in strategic planning. So I can understand why the department isn't waiting for OLG to solve this problem of strategic planning in local government. But my pitch to local leaders is that you need to wake up and smell the coffee that despite its best intentions, our state government cannot solve your problems for you. What's more, I'd argue it's not their role, it's your role if you choose to accept it, if you take responsibility for it. But to do so, you're going to need a different set of tools. Our situation is the opposite of the old saying, a poor workman blames his tools. Our problem is the poor tools designed by state government, not the poor workmen and women in local government. Again, this is not a criticism of our state government. The tools that they've designed are no different to those used in other jurisdictions. So clearly it's not their fault. But my pitch is to local leaders that if you want to step up and take responsibility for solving the problems of your local community, rather than waiting for our state government to do it for you, then I've designed a different set of tools that can support you in doing so. Now, if I were to refer to this set of tools as a storytelling framework, I might struggle to convince you. That doesn't sound appropriate in this context. We want facts, not fiction, right? To those who can't get past that, think of this as an assurance framework. As I'll explain, in a technical sense, it is a management system. But I'm going to describe it as a storytelling framework because we need to think differently. We cannot simply tweak a few things and carry on as we have before. We need a paradigm shift. We need to tell a better story. And I'm going to demonstrate that this story can be true if it reflects the real world. And this story can give assurance if the people who are telling it have earned the trust of the local communities that are relying on the safety and security of the water supply. Okay then, so how does this story go? Andrew Francis tells me the civic leaders at Parkes Shire Council find this analogy helpful. Their role is to allocate resources, the fuel used by Council's executive leadership to operate the ship, to take the passengers, the local community, to their destination, which includes a safe and secure water supply. But the primary role of staff is to provide advice to those steering the ship, and the primary role of the mayor and councillors is to engage the passengers when charting the course, taking account of how much the fare will be to generate the resources to get there. And so the leadership of council's organisation, the relationship between leaders at different levels is far more complex than the traditional policy operations or strategy implementation split makes out. But that said, it is true that the governing body steers the ship by making a policy decision. They do so by adjusting the half-dozen levers in the revenue policy, part of Council's annual operational plan. This is the means by which the resources are allocated, which is how Council's organisation works towards what our goal is. The primary role of staff is not simply to execute this plan, but to provide robust and timely advice to those steering the ship about the present situation, what is, and how sure we are that we can and will reach what our goal is, a safe and secure water supply, among other things, given how we plan to do what we do, because that's why we're all aboard this ship, paying the fare to take the journey in the first place, right? So here's the big picture. This dashboard identifies the destination that civic leaders are steering their community ship towards in the context of why these things are of most value. They've elaborated what this looks like in the delivery program. The goal of a safe and secure water, reliable and efficient water supply, that's not going to change after the election or when you drive over the boundary of the local government area. Central Tablelands Water could be performing this function in Parkes Shire like they do in much of Cabon country. Who performs it, the function is secondary. The primary question is, how sure are we that our local community will reach our destination? Call it the strategic objective in the community strategic plan or the planning priority in the local strategic planning statement. This same goal is relevant even if it is an organisation other than council who performs it. A topical example will draw out the key point. Another feature of this goal that civic leaders are steering the ship towards is appropriate health and allied services. But the present situation is that there's no doctor at Parkes Hospital. So council does not feel this goal is being met, and so they've advocated to state government on their community's behalf because civic leadership is the most basic function of local government. Council performs these dozen external service functions because it has the responsibility for doing so, or it has taken on board that responsibility. But like I say, this is secondary. We must first be clear what functions the community needs performed and what it looks like to reach that goal in the real world. And the clarity of these goals, like a safe and secure water supply, is crucial. It establishes the common purpose that Council's leadership is working towards. This is the common thread in a story told by civic leaders and enacted in the real world by executive leaders. And it's this that the advice to those steering the ship must be focused on. What they need to know first and foremost is that we're not going to reach our goal. We're going to hit the rocks. And then here's how we can change our course to gain sufficient assurance that we'll reach our goal. The strategic decision to change course is made by adjusting how much we invest in the activities to do what we do, to perform the function our local community needs. But to keep our ship on an even keel, we must then adjust one or more of the levers on the revenue side of the ledger. So the purpose of this dashboard is to support civic leaders in making these decisions to steer the ship. It is a means by which executive leaders can provide clear advice to the civic leaders about how sure we are that we can and will realise our goals. This red warning light needs no explanation, right? It begs the question, what's the problem? How do we fix it? How do we gain sufficient assurance that our water supply will be safe and secure? And how much will that cost? So I hope you can start to see how this storytelling framework might serve as an assurance framework for local water utilities. In fact, an assurance framework for local government in general. So here I want to explain how this relates to the regulatory and assurance framework for local water utilities that the Department developed in response to the Auditor General's recommendations. For starters, as I say, despite the Department's aspirations to be the regulator of local water utilities, it's not. At least it's not in any of the ways that count in the context of this discussion. The Department describes its own role here in terms of three core areas of its responsibility. So ignoring the regulatory side, this leaves strategic planning and performance monitoring. But if local leaders are to take responsibility for solving their own problems instead of relying on the Department to do it for you, you need to recognise two things. Firstly, what the Department is really doing here is just performance reporting, not monitoring. I'll explain why taking that distinction on board is crucial to gain assurance in local water utilities. Second, there's absolutely no integration between the planning and reporting in the Department's assurance framework here, whereas in local government we've got the integrated planning and reporting framework, right? And this is where I want to challenge local leaders to think for themselves. This is just the Department's understanding of its own role, right? Besides the fact that it's ultimately your role, not theirs, to assure your local communities that their water supply is safe and secure, they've demonstrated that they're struggling, right? Do you really want to sit back and hope that it won't take them another 5 years to solve your problems for you and that we won't run into another drought in the interim? The alternative approach I'm offering to help you to undertake, like that which I'm working on with Parkes Shire Council, and look, I'm not saying instead of writing integrated water cycle management strategies that they want you to write. If you're one of the 60 odd councils who've got an IWCM in train, but whom they categorise as not participating in their assurance framework here, I'd strongly recommend that you keep going with that. But I'd give you two things to think about. First, I'd say that back in 2021, when I wrote the report, the Department commissioned me to write that informed this guidance that they issued at the time they published the regulatory and assurance framework on using the integrated planning and reporting framework for local water utility strategic planning. They told me that there were 60 odd councils with IWCMs in progress then. From what I hear, that there's 60 odd now. So life's what happens while you're busy making other plans, as John Lennon sang. So that's the first thing. The second point I'd make is that writing a plan and even getting on this exclusive list is not equivalent to gaining assurance in local water utilities. For starters, Riverina Water County Council's IWCM is clearly non-compliant with the Department's own guidance. That's immediately obvious to anyone who knows anything about these plans. The goal of such planning is, as it says here, is to determine the lowest sustainable price path, but the typical residential bill is clearly cannot be sustained. The plan here is to charge customers 56% more in 30 years for this same service. Now, I wouldn't be alarmed because Riverina Water has never followed this price path anyway. In fact, it seems to me the whole plan is wrong. When I look at this forecast expenditure, there's no major capital works in the later years driving the need for more revenues. The only thing driving the increase is the need for an increase is the increase in operations and maintenance, which I'd imagine is coming from this increasing demand from growth, which should bring with it increased revenues. For the record, I raised this issue with both the department and Riverina Water at the time, and I'm happy for someone to explain to me how I've misinterpreted all this, but it seems pretty straightforward. So I'd say to local leaders that I'm not convinced that getting your council's name on this list is enough to gain insurance in relation to your strategic planning. But my broader point is that the problem in a drought is a lack of water, not a lack of plans. Reporting the fact that you've run out of water is of no help to anyone. We need to approach this problem of assurance differently, and the only viable means of doing so, I'd argue, is via the integrated planning and reporting framework. Our state government is clearly confused, but you need to recognise that the Local Government Act establishes the legal framework for the system of local government in New South Wales. The Act describes the functions of councils, including local water utility functions. This was something that I tried to convince the department of back in 2021, but to no avail. They clearly haven't taken this on board. I mean, they've said here that local water utilities decide how to achieve effective evidence-based strategic planning. They don't. Councils must do their strategic planning under the IPNR framework. They can choose to write extra plans on top of this. For example, they can choose to write an IWCM strategy. But why write another strategy that's duplicating the information in IPNR? That's the thing. This is the desktop review of... so in the desktop review of over half of all water utilities in New South Wales that I undertook to establish an evidence base for my report, yes, I read the publicly available documents of 47 out of 92 councils, and I found very poor levels of compliance in relation to what was then the old best practice framework, and I pegged it at about 16% compliance, which is better than less than 10% the Auditor General quoted, but I might have been more generous about what had been approved. But then in relation to the mandatory requirements for strategic planning in relation to assets and finances under IPNR, I found less than half of councils were compliant there either. So it makes no sense. Why would we continue to operate these two planning frameworks in parallel for 15 years now? Councils are writing two sets of plans using different terminology to describe the same thing. Why would we do that if we're struggling to even write one set of plans? It's simple. It's the compliance mindset that dominates local government, and that serves us well in many respects, but it has undermined the effectiveness of local government in the performance of this most crucial of functions, local water utility functions. And so my pitch to local leaders is that you take on board what the department is saying here. You decide how to do your strategic planning to gain assurance in relation to your local water utility functions. I'd argue you don't, you do it in the IPNR, but my point is that the department is throwing it over to you. I'd argue it's very clear that what they really want and need to perform their primary role, which is targeting investment in town water infrastructure, is advice from councils as to the need for such major investment. And while they don't say this, of course, I reckon they've voted with their feet. I reckon the reason that they've taken no action on this issue I identified with Riverina Water's plan was that they got what they needed out of it. And I dare say Riverina Water got what they needed out of it in that they got their name on the leaderboard here, right? So what was it the department wanted? They established that New South Wales government wouldn't be called on over the next 30 years to foot the bill for any major investments to secure the water supply of the 76,000 people serviced by Riverina Water. And please don't get me wrong, this is not a criticism of the department. What local communities across regional New South Wales really need the department to do is not to do the strategic planning on behalf of local government, but rather to target investments in the solutions required to secure their water supplies, to improve the environmental performance of their sewage systems, to support investments in new and upgraded infrastructure to meet growing demand, to facilitate that growth. And so that is, I think, what New South Wales government's really interested in anyway, getting a grip on how sure we are that our water supplies will be secure through the next drought, and if there's any major risks, how to address those and how much that will cost. A final thing that needs to be said here, if the 90% of local water utilities who the department categorises as not participating, the 60 odd are trying to participate. They've been trying for years to make it through this bureaucratic maze, but the reason that they want to make it through is not to gain assurance in relation to their local water utility functions, but to gain a grant. And so if this is true, and I think both state and local governments are behaving as if it's true, I know for sure local communities aren't interested in writing strategic plans. The outcome that local communities want and need is not a strategic plan, but what comes out of the tap, a safe and secure water supply. That's what we all want assurance about, right? Well, I'm going to explain that if local leaders learn to tell a story with service as the common thread in IP&R, and so it becomes the integrated planning assurance and reporting framework, local government can gain such assurance. But to understand what that looks like, we first need to understand the mandatory assurance framework that's established by the Local Government Act and the Local Government General Regulation, because councils don't get to decide on how to do this either. The mandatory assurance framework for local government, which is about the how sure question, right? It's described by OLG and its guidance here in terms of 3 core requirements. The Audit, Risk and Improvement Committee, all councils must now have in place, has oversight of its risk management framework and the activities of its internal audit function. All general managers will have recently attested that this assurance framework is now in place, including that council has adopted a risk management framework consistent with ISO 31000. I'd argue that that's a problem because OLG's guidance is itself in conflict with the international standard. While OLG quotes ISO as emphasising the need to integrate risk management into significant activities and functions, the approach that OLG and the risk management experts have led, it seems, all councils to adopt, it means that they've adopted a new bureaucratic framework that sits alongside the existing bureaucratic frameworks, and it's basically focused on providing assurance that nothing bad will happen instead of, as what ISO actually says, providing assurance that council can and will make good things happen, managing the effects of uncertainty on our objectives. The best way to clear up this confusion is to begin with a model that OLG references here, which everyone operating in this space will be familiar with, although since 2020 it has been referred to simply as the 3 lines model. The off-the-shelf version isn't much help to councils, not only because we must first insert the ARIC's role in overseeing the second and third lines. They're both focused on the how sure question, right? But we must also recognise that this assurance framework only makes sense in the context of what council is here to do. Why council exists is to perform functions the local community needs, like providing a safe and secure water supply. This is what the governing body is ultimately accountable for. So OLG's guidance on risk management is steering councils completely off track when it looks at the roles and responsibilities through this lens of the traditional policy, operations or strategy implementation split. The governing body adopts a risk appetite statement, which is, to put it bluntly, a policy position that they don't want anything bad to happen. And then they hand that over to the general manager to implement. And good luck, I say. It's fundamentally mistaken. Read the Act. The GM does not have ultimate accountability for risk management in the council. The governing body does. They are what ISO calls top management. They direct and control the organisation, steer the ship. by allocating resources to management, the general manager and staff with delegated authority and responsibility for specific activities from the GM, and that's how a council performs its functions. And so while civic leaders are accountable to stakeholders for managing risk, the management team, the executive leaders, are responsible for undertaking actions to achieve organisational objectives, what our goal is, including managing risk, the effect of uncertainty on those objectives. And they are also responsible, and I'd argue should be accountable, for providing robust and timely advice to the civic leaders who are steering the ship, so that they've got time to change the course, so that we don't hit the rocks. But once this advice is provided, it is then a strategic decision by the governing body to either allocate the resources to change course, or if not, they thereby accept the risk. So as I say, much of the confusion in the roles in risk management here surrounds this risk appetite statement, which OLG has elevated to the central place in its guidance, despite the term risk appetite statement or risk appetite not being used once in ISO 31000. This can perhaps best be cleared up with reference to the risk management process in ISO 31000. We must begin by establishing the context, the story within which we perform our role. Risk is effective uncertainty on objectives, so what is our goal? And more important, why do we need assurance that we can and will realise it? These are questions to ask and answer in consultation with stakeholders, but here OLG fundamentally misconstrues, in fact misquotes ISO 31000 to make it say what OLG thinks it should say. These criteria are not a policy position about how much risk we're willing to take in a generic sense. We've got no appetite for reputational risk, but a moderate appetite for financial risk. That's the way councils are writing risk appetite statements now. No, read the standard. Risk criteria are to be customised to the specific purpose and scope of the activity under consideration. So once we've established the context and the criteria for those activities, we identify and analyse the threats to achieving our goal, the purpose that we're working towards. And this is where executive leaders must step up and provide the advice to support the decisions made by civic leaders about how to steer the ship. And the rubber hits the road, the last part of the risk assessment, the risk evaluation is where, says ISO, we're supporting decisions. How this works is by comparing the results of the risk analysis against the specific risk criteria established at the start, which are customised to the activities to perform this specific function. ISO says, identifies the options here. We can go back and undertake further analysis to better understand the risk, or we can reconsider what our goal is. And I'm not sure how civic leaders would do that in relation to the goal of a safe and secure water supply. So the only other options are to allocate resources to treat the risk, or if they choose not to do so, or if they simply cannot afford to do so, council thereby accepts the risk. Money talks, bullshit walks. A final point of clarification that local leaders need to take on board here in the context of assurance in local water utilities is the distinction that ISO makes between monitoring and reporting. This is crucial. It's not enough to focus on lag indicators, reporting on was our water safe to drink by testing the quality in the reticulation. We must focus on lead indicators. Will our water be safe to drink? Which in the context of a drinking water management system that New South Wales Health requires all local water utilities to have in place, this is about monitoring critical control points. So if we return to the three lines model, we must recognise that while this is about providing assurance that the actions undertaken by management will achieve the organisational objectives, the establishment of those objectives is outside the scope of the risk management framework, the assurance framework. In the world of ISO standards, a framework is just about the how, the process, whereas a management system is the interrelated and interacting elements of an organisation to establish objectives as well as the processes to achieve them. how we do what we do. So sticking with drinking water management, what we aim to do is supply water that's safe to drink. How we do it is by undertaking the actions to implement our drinking water management plan, and how we gain sufficient assurance that our water will be safe to drink is by monitoring critical control points as part of this drinking water management system. While they play little or no role in the context of drinking water management, it's important to note that in the world of ISO management systems, the role that the Audit, Risk and Improvement Committee is playing in local government is as the management review function. In the context of this model, the role that state government agencies such as New South Wales Health and the Department are playing is as the 1, 2, 3, 4th line of defence. They give stakeholders additional assurance that so this is the local communities drinking the water, sufficient assurance that the water that council supplies is safe. ISO 31000 refers to them as oversight bodies. But my point is that what they have oversight of is this management system. This isn't optional. This is the only way to gain assurance, the assurance that we need in relation to local water utilities and all other council functions. And so having laid out what I'd argue is the mandatory assurance framework for local government and explained how we can expand that into a management system effectively for council's organisation as a whole, incorporating how and why we do what we do overall, and thus encompassing the entirety of the integrated planning and reporting framework, I can now explain how to approach the integrated planning and reporting framework as an assurance framework so that it becomes the integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework, I suppose, which is councils don't get to decide to use because this is the legal framework for our system of local government. Or put simply, the department's strategic planning outcomes here are better understood as elements of a management system, or better yet, as elements of an integrated management system. But in the same way that councils benefit from the guidance in ISO 31000 to support them in adopting a risk management framework, they will benefit from a clear set of requirements for the management system that the risk management framework is supposed to be integrated within. ISO says the purpose of the risk management framework is to integrate risk management into significant activities and functions. In local government, the delivery program is where councils detail the principal activities to perform their functions, and so what we need is a management systems approach to IP&R. And that's what I'm offering via the Common Thread framework, which adapts the requirements of the asset management system in ISO 55001 as effectively a management systems approach to the integrated planning and reporting framework. But like I say, because it's got council's risk management framework integrated within it, it's better described as the integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework for local government. If I strip away the details, we can see this as a storytelling framework that helps civic leaders tell a story with service as the common thread. A story is that is then enacted in the real world by council's executive leaders. To begin, we must discard the term assets, or else everyone thinks that they'll misunderstand this story as just being about infrastructure. It's not. ISO defines an asset as a thing of value, and so we're best off describing this as a service portfolio, and what is represented in this dashboard at Parkes. And so our story starts with what is. This is both the end of the last chapter and the beginning of the next one. The performance of the previous council is evaluated via the State of Our City or Shire report, which establishes the context within which to ask why certain things about the current state of our world are a problem, and thus priorities for investment moving forwards. Perhaps the key move strategically here is that the local strategic planning statement, the land use plan, which is mandatory under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, bookends the planning process, and thus it grounds us in reality. What I'm trying to do here is to get us away from the abstractions that plague our community strategic plans. We don't just want a safe and healthy community, we want safe drinking water, safe roads and appropriate health services. That's what it looks like in the real world to be a safe and healthy community. It's about understanding things in context, providing context for our decision making. Telling our story in such a practical, down-to-earth terms frames the decisions that civic leaders then make about what our goal is in relation to the functions that council itself steps up and takes responsibility for in the delivery program, or which it's advocating, like I explained earlier with the Parkes Hospital example. It's then driving the advocacy to ensure that council's functions that functions performed by other organisations are meeting the community's needs. But for council's own functions, this establishment of what our goal is then orients the strategic planning undertaken by executive leaders for council's activities to work towards those goals within the resources that are available in the resourcing strategy. A key feature of the Common Thread framework, the integrated approach, is that the how and how sure elements are here not two separate questions, let alone two separate systems, as in OLG's approach, but rather two sides of the one coin. How we do it determines how sure we are. Gaining more assurance means changing our plans. As we saw, the last step of the risk assessment is risk evaluation. It's demonstrating what we value, why this investment is a priority, to gain sufficient assurance that we can and will realise what our goal is. This is not about the governing body adopting some abstract risk appetite statement. We have a low appetite for reputational risk, but rather taking on board the advice of executive leaders and demonstrating their risk appetite, how much they are or are not willing to take in relation to the specific purpose of this activity. How we do what we do in making the decision, in adjusting the levers here in the revenue policy, in the operational plan. Like I say, money talks, bullshit walks. The sacrifices that we make, how we utilise our resources, demonstrates what we value and how much. Our state government bureaucracy has made things terribly complicated, but this cuts through all of that while still complying with all the mandatory requirements. Once civic leaders learn to tell a story with services the common thread, informed by advice from executive leaders responsible for enacting that story in the real world, council's leadership has a common purpose to work towards. They've grounded council's story in the real world. Now, obviously, a few more details over and above this dashboard won't go astray, and this is where a risk-based approach comes into its own. The investment in more detailed planning is focused in on further analysing the threats that you're most concerned about. You're no longer writing plans for their own sake. Plans are nothing, planning is everything, says Dwight Eisenhower. But I'm not saying that some more detailed plans won't be helpful, but I am arguing that once a council has got its story straight in this service dashboard, even if it's only sketched out, the civic leaders have all the basic information they need to make informed decisions in steering their ship. Governing the most complex organisation in our local area. I know that sounds incredible given councils are producing thousands, not hundreds, thousands of pages to try to get their story straight. And what I'm saying here is that a dashboard like this will be of more help to civic leaders than all of that, but only in an environment of trust. Without the trust of the people, the state cannot stand, as Confucius say. It seems to me that we've taken Deming's saying to heart, in God we trust, all others must bring data, but like we saw at Riverina Water, we're not actually interpreting the data. All we want is an impressive looking bureaucratic plan written by some technical expert to sit on a shelf that the state government agencies have endorsed with their approval. Again, it's this compliance mindset that dominates in local government, which serves us well in many respects, but it's undermining the effectiveness of local government in the performance of this most crucial of functions, local water utility functions, because we've forgotten how to think for ourselves. Trust is not a checklist, as Simon Sinek says. An assurance framework doesn't give people trust. New South Wales Health isn't satisfied with councils writing a drinking water management plan. That's not how it performs its role as an external assurance provider. The plan itself and the monitoring to provide assurance that the management system is under control, they're a means to an end. We need to recognise plans don't provide assurance. Monitoring doesn't even provide assurance. A management system can provide assurance. It includes plans and monitoring. As New South Wales Health and local water utilities across the state have demonstrated, because we all trust that our water supply is safe to drink, because local government has earned people's trust over the course of several decades. It's hard to appreciate the significance of this unless and until something goes wrong and we lose that trust. And we're very fortunate in Australia that we haven't had something like what occurred with the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan. Most of us wouldn't even think to log on to our local water utilities website to check out our latest water quality performance reports, but that doesn't mean we can or should abandon that testing. Trust but verify, as Reagan said, but it does suggest that we can learn something about what we need to do to gain assurance in local water utilities generally from what has worked for decades in the area of water quality, and that is a management systems approach. If the department wants to perform its assurance role, then what it needs local government to do is to establish a management system that the department then has oversight of. The department describes its role as having oversight of local water utilities in the delivery of safe, secure, reliable and affordable services. That's what our goal is. And in the management of water service risks. That's how sure we are that we can achieve what our goal is. But if we consider these core areas by which it provides this assurance in strategic planning, over 90% of councils aren't participating in their assurance framework, and what it refers to as performance monitoring is really only performance reporting. So despite the department's best intentions, it cannot perform its role as it's describing it here. To put it bluntly, it cannot at this time give local communities in regional New South Wales assurance that their cities and towns won't run out of water in the next drought. And again, this is not a criticism of the department. The role we need them to perform is in targeting investment in town water infrastructure. I'd argue that local government needs to step up and take responsibility for the planning that establishes the evidence base that enables the department to then target that investment. So, okay then, get to the point. What does it look like in practice? So let's return to Parkes. Again, I'm not saying some more detailed plans won't be helpful, but I am arguing that once civic leaders have learnt to tell a coherent story with service as the common thread, once council has got a story straight in this service dashboard, even if it's only sketched out, then the civic leaders have all the basic information they need to make informed decisions in steering the ship, governing the most complex organisation in our local area, so long as there's an environment of trust. So we know that if there's a problem, we know we're going to get a warning of impending danger in time to take corrective action. And what I'm saying is that if this management system is in place at Parkes and if the department has trust in it too, again, trust but verify, then our state government knows that they're going to get robust and timely advice from council that there is a problem that council is struggling to solve on its own, and so they need external assistance. Now, that might be technical assistance, but it's more likely to be simply funding support. And if councils are telling their story with service as a common thread, not only coherently but consistently, then this will establish the evidence base the department needs to target investments in town water infrastructure across regional New South Wales based not only on the level of risk, but also the community's capacity to solve its own problems given the resources that it has available. Okay, so what's the problem at Parkes? The red warning light relates to, first and foremost, to what our goal is in relation to water security, which civic leaders have identified as having sufficient capacity to meet current and future demand, including for development, even during periods of extended drought. And like I say, I reckon that won't change after an election or when you go over the boundary of the local government area, or if Central Tablelands Water was to take over responsibility for performing this function of the water supply utility in Parkes Shire. This table then elaborates what this problem is. The top of the list is that the pipeline from Lake Endeavour was taken out in the 2022 floods. There's little council can do to control this risk other than to draw water from the remaining alternative sources, and so the risk level, even with the controls in place, remains high. And the only way to treat it is to seek external support to replace the pipeline or to develop a financial plan to pay for the project themselves. And that would have been a lot of money. It would also almost certainly have meant a further increase in rates and charges. And just as importantly, that investment cannot be considered in isolation. It must be weighed up against the need to invest in all these other competing priorities for the resources within Council's water fund. And then even more broadly, it needs to be weighed up in terms of the cost of living pressures on the local community in general. But thankfully, as it turns out, our state government shares Council's goal of water security in Parkes Shire, and Council's desire to gain more assurance that it can and will be achieved. And so they've come through with a grant for $22.9 million, which is how much Council needs to address this threat. And so with this money raining down from above, the state government has adjusted the grants lever here. This is a crucial insight. Local government has limited control over most of these levers. For example, it doesn't have the power to adjust the rates lever for general fund itself. But in terms of the water fund here, this $22.9 million is now available to keep the ship on an even keel and invest that over here in on the expenditure side of the ledger. And that's how much Council needs to spend to realise what our goal is, a secure water supply for Parkes Shire. But of course, Council isn't out of the woods yet. The Lake Endeavour pipeline is ticked off the list, but it's now on to the next big ticket item, which is the lack of capacity in the system to meet the future demand from the Special Activation Precinct and North Parkes Mine. And that's what I'm working on with Andrew and his team now, in conjunction with the planners, who are about to review the local strategic planning statement for Parkes Shire. The planning for water utility functions cannot happen in isolation from planning for land use for the people who need the water. And this is why, although I acknowledge that the recent review of the Community Strategic Plan for Parkes Shire was important, I'd argue it's not the peak planning document. At least it shouldn't be, because more than anything, if this story we're telling is to be true, then it must be grounded in reality. And that's why the land use plan, the local strategic planning statement, should, I'd argue, be elevated to the primary position here. It should serve as the bookends for the planning process. What's the state our Shire is in now, and how do our local communities need Council to perform its functions? All the other organisations, how do the local communities need them to perform their functions if we're to continue to work towards what our goal is? And so I call this a storytelling framework. You could also call this the integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework. That's a bit of a mouthful. Or you could call it elements of an integrated management system. And what I want to do in wrapping up this video is to demonstrate that the department wants to see councils telling exactly this story here. I won't go through the 106 expectations set out in the 500 plus pages of guidance across the dozen strategic planning outcomes one by one, not least because I don't need to, but once we're clear what our goal is, we've established a common purpose. We can cut through all the bureaucratic bullshit and start telling a coherent story with service as the common thread. The service outcome that we're after is, firstly, a safe and secure water supply and a sewage system that minimises environmental impacts. We also want these systems to have the capacity, capability and efficiency to service the needs of our local communities, which is why local government performs these functions in the first place, right? Understanding other key risks and challenges is about asking how sure we are, of course, and then understanding how we solve these problems and so deliver the services that our local communities need is the other side of that same coin. which immediately begs the question, how much resources do we need to invest and how much revenues have we got coming in to cover that? And so in terms of meeting the department's expectations, by asking and answering these 4 questions, documenting those answers in our formal planning, it's all happening within the integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework, which, as I say, it's the legal framework for the system of local government in New South Wales as established by the Local Government Act. And this is where the department's lack of interest in IP&R, while understandable given the way that OLG has led councils to practice it, which I've got to say is so bad that it's in conflict with the Act. OLG has completely missed the significance of the elevation of functions as the focus of planning in the 2016 amendments to the Act. So I get it, but the fact is that because the department has no regulatory authority to compel councils to meet its expectations, it's got to work within this legal framework, and the department has demonstrated, I'd say it's more than disinterest, it's ignorance of this legal framework. I mean, in establishing its expectations in relation to these next couple of strategic planning outcomes here, make and implement sound strategic decisions and implement sound pricing and prudent financial management, there is no mention of Council's operational plan or the revenue policy, which, as I've said, is the legal means by which such decisions are made. There's no mention of the resourcing strategy or the long-term financial plan, which is the legal means by which councils must practice sound financial management. But I don't want to end on a downer, so here's my ray of hope in establishing its expectations in relation to promoting integrated water cycle management. The department has mentioned both the local strategic planning statement and the community strategic plan. That's great, but what councils now need is some guidance on what it looks like in practice. And that's what I tried to convince both the department and the working group, which, like I say, OLG was represented on back in 2021, when I sketched out a potential alternative approach to IP&R. I don't pretend I was particularly clear on that, but I think I was clear enough that either of these state government departments, if either of them were interested, they could have pursued it. But I've seen no evidence that they are interested. I'm aware that the department funded a project that Central New South Wales Joint Organisation engaged my friend and colleague Karen Legg to undertake, and they prepared a toolkit to give councils guidance in using the IP&R framework to satisfy the requirements of the regulatory and assurance framework. But with all due respect to those involved, I reckon that what that project demonstrated is that these overly bureaucratic frameworks are overcomplicating things and putting 2 of them together while leaving them both intact. It just makes things more overcomplicated, and what's more, the key here is to gain assurance in local water utilities, not IP&R, is the risk management framework which all councils must now have in place. And so remember, what's the first step in the risk management process? It's establishing the context. And that's what the Common Thread framework is designed to do. The context for local leaders to make and implement good decisions, and so give their communities assurance that their water supplies will be safe and secure. It's about telling that story. And so if that sounds good to you, if you'd like to join Parkes Shire Council in a coalition of the willing, local leaders who are willing to approach this crucial problem differently, then I'm sure Andrew Francis at Parkes would be happy to have a yarn to you, or you can look me up. My contact details are on my website at commonthreadconsulting.com.au. But for now, thanks for watching.